Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Somewhere deep beneath the mountains of Fenris, in a chamber carved from living rock by the hands of craftsmen who died 10,000 years ago, something ancient breathes. Not quite breathes. Sustains, maybe. Persists. The machines that keep it alive hum at a frequency just below hearing, a low, steady vibration that you feel in your chest before you ever register it as sound. The walls around it are thick with frost. The air is cold enough to see, and every exhale from the support systems drifts upward in thin, white ribbons before dissolving into the dark. Runes have been carved into every surface, warnings in some places, prayers in others. The accumulated devotion of centuries scratched into stone by hands that have long since turned to dust. And then there is the sarcophagus itself. It sits at the center of this chamber like a throne that has never been vacated. It is massive, baroque, uncovered in decorations its occupant finds deeply irritating. Laurels and honors and seals of victory, placed there by a chapter that reveres what rests inside more than almost anything else in existence. The machine is old. Not old in the way that a favorite sword gets old, or the way a fortress gets old. This thing is old in the way that certain stars are old. Its age is a weight you can feel pressing against you, a kind of gravity all its own. Inside this machine, as connected to it through tubes and wires and ancient bionics that even the most skilled tech priests can barely maintain, is what is left of a man. The man's name is Bjorn, and right now he is sleeping. Welcome back, everyone. Today we are telling the story of Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the oldest surviving space marine in the entire Imperium of man, a warrior who has lived through more history than most civilizations managed to accumulate, and a figure whose saga is genuinely without equal in the 41st millennium. This is a story about war, certainly, but it is also a story about grief, about loyalty, about what it means to carry loss for so long it becomes part of who you are. And it is a story about one grumpy, magnificent, deeply complicated warrior who has seen everything the galaxy has to offer, and is, on some level, deeply unimpressed by most of it. Sit back, get comfortable. Let's talk about the bear. That's Section 1, The Living Legend. There is a ritual that the Space Wolves have performed at the dawn of each new millennium, and it goes something like this. The Iron Priests, the chapter's tech adepts, the keepers of machinery and machine spirits, make their way down through the deepest levels of the Fang, the chapter's great mountain fortress on the world of Fenris. They carry tools and incense, sacred oils, and instruments of measurement. They speak prayers in the harsh, a guttural dialect of their chapter as they work, checking systems and reading outputs. And then, when everything is prepared, they begin the process of coaxing a consciousness back from the edge of oblivion. Systems come online one by one. Power cells charge. Life support readings climb from the baseline minimums of deep stasis towards something approaching active function. The chamber warms, fractionally, as heat bleeds from awakening machinery. And somewhere inside the sarcophagus, while in the organic components still connected to all this metal and wire, something that has been dormant for a very long time begins to surface. Then, eventually, the entire chapter gathers in the Great Hall of the Fang. Every warrior, from the most experienced Longfang veterans to the youngest Bloodclaws still raw from their first battles, stands in that enormous space and waits. Fenrisian ale flows. Old songs are sung. Oaths are sworn and renewed. And the noise of it is extraordinary. The Space Wolves are not a chapter known for quiet reserve, and when they celebrate, they do it with the full force of people who know that every day above ground might be their last. And then the doors open. The entire hall goes silent. The Iron Priests enter first, escorting their charge. Behind them comes the Dreadnought, and the Great Wolf himself, Logan Grimnar, chapter master of the Space Wolves. As a warrior of over 800 years' experience who commands the respect of some of the most fearsome fighters in the galaxy, steps aside and cedes his place. because what walks into this hall is older than him, older than his grandfather's grandfather, older than any living institution either of them has ever encountered. The Dreadnought stops. Its optics sweep the assembled warriors. And then, in a voice that has been mechanical for 500 years, longer than most chapters have existed, it speaks. What it says exactly varies from account to account, but the effect is always the same. The warriors listening, supermen engineered for war, creatures of post-human capability, who have faced horrors that would shatter ordinary minds, stand there quietly, like children gathered around a fire to hear something they need to understand. Because Bjorn the Fell-Handed is not just old, he is a living connection to an age that has passed into mythology for everyone else. He is a bridge between the present and an era so distant that its events are recorded in the same breath as legend. He fought in the Great Crusade. He stood at Prospero when it burned. He was there, present, in the room, when the Emperor was still walking among humanity. He knew Leman Russ not as a story or a sacred memory, but as a person Bjorn found aggravating on occasion, loved above all other things, and has been waiting for ever since. Well, he holds more than 10,000 years of memory in the organic remnants of a brain that should have died a very long time ago. The Space Wolves wake him every millennium to hear his stories. They wake him in moments of crisis, when the chapter needs wisdom or firepower or both. And every time, this ancient, bitter, magnificent warrior emerges from the darkness of stasis, takes stock of a galaxy that has moved on without him, and finds a way to be useful. His full title is Bjorn the Fell-Handed, venerable dreadnought of the Space Wolves, the eldest, the Trueclaw, the revered one, and last of the company of Russ. In older records, before the machinery changed his voice, before the centuries of war stripped everything extraneous away, he was sometimes simply called Bear, which is, fittingly, what the name Bjorn means in every Scandinavian tongue that has ever existed on old Earth. He is the oldest loyal space marine alive. But he is arguably the single most significant living artifact of the age of the Great Crusade remaining in the Imperium's possession. And he is, by all available accounts, profoundly cranky about it. To appreciate just how staggering that age is, consider the scale of it another way. When Bjorn first drew breath as a living space marine, the Imperium was still young and ascending. The Emperor was alive and walking among his creations. Then the Great Crusade, the most ambitious military and civilizational project in human history, was in full swing. There were 20 space marine legions, each one a force of hundreds of thousands of warriors, cutting a path through the galaxy in the name of human unity. The scale of ambition in that era is almost incomprehensible from the vantage of the 41st millennium, where survival itself has become the central organizing principle. Bjorn has watched all of that die. He watched the heresy unfold in real time. He watched legions become monsters. He watched the Emperor, the closest thing the galaxy had to a singular protector of humanity's future, be broken on his own son's blade and entombed in a life support mechanism that the entire Imperium now worships as a divine throne. He watched the Golden Age end and the long darkness begin, and he has been living in the long darkness ever since, waking up periodically to find that things have mostly gotten worse in the intervals, doing his best to push back against the entropy, and then returning to the cold quiet to wait for whatever comes next. The Space Wolves have a concept called the Wolf Time. It is their apocalypse myth. The final battle, the end of all things, the moment when their lost Primarch Leman Russ has promised to return and fight at their side one last time. And the Space Wolves as a chapter have organized significant portions of their cultural identity around this prophecy. And Bjorn's relationship to it is the most intimate possible. He was the last person Russ spoke to before he left. He is the living continuity between the age of the Wolf King and whatever age comes after. He is, in some fundamental sense, keeping the light on until Russ comes home. He is also, as mentioned, extremely irritable about the decorations on his sarcophagus. While this is his story, all 10,000 years of it, Before we get into the heart of it, I want to say something about why this particular character matters so much in the context of Warhammer 40,000 as a whole. In a setting that is defined by scale, by the sheer, overwhelming vastness of its history, its geography, its cast of characters, it is easy for individual stories to get lost. But the galaxy is 10,000 light-years wide and has been the site of continuous warfare for as long as recorded history reaches. The individual warrior, even the extraordinary one, can seem small against that backdrop. Bjorn refuses to be small. He is a single point of consciousness that has managed, through sheer stubborn persistence and the extreme technical commitment of his chapter's Iron Priests, to remain continuous across the entire span of the setting's history. And he is not a legend about someone who was there. He is the person who was there. And every time the Space Wolves wake him up, that continuity becomes real in a way that nothing else in the Imperium can replicate. He is why the Space Wolves are not just another chapter. He is the living proof that they are what they claim to be. The original Sons of Russ, inheritors of a tradition that predates every institution currently operating in the Imperium, are warriors who have been at this since the very beginning and are still, impossibly, at it today. That is worth spending some time on, so let us begin at the beginning. Section 2. The World That Made Him, Fenris and the Space Wolves. To understand Bjorn, you have to understand where he came from. And to understand where he came from, you have to understand Fenris. Fenris is a death world. That designation gets applied to a lot of planets in the Warhammer 40k setting. But Fenris earns it in a particular and vivid way. It is a world of extremes so severe they seem almost personal, as though the planet itself has a grudge. For most of its year, Fenris is locked in deep winter, the kind of winter that swallows continents whole, that sheets the world's single vast ocean in ice so thick entire tribes can migrate across it, that makes survival itself a kind of victory. Temperatures drop so low that the sea freezes from edge to edge, as in the Fenrisians, the human population that has somehow endured here since the dark age of technology, travel between landmasses on foot across ice that groans and shifts beneath them. Then, at the extreme end of its long elliptical orbit, Fenris swings close to its sun, and the winter ends in the worst possible way. The ice melts all at once, the seas churn, lava cracks up through the crust. Coastlines change shape in the space of days as new volcanic islands rise from the ocean floor and old landmasses disappear beneath the waves. What was solid ground yesterday is the bottom of a boiling sea tomorrow. The tribes that have spent months crossing the frozen ocean on foot now find themselves racing against geological transformation just to find somewhere to stand. The people who survive all of this are, predictably, remarkable. Fenrisians are not soft. They cannot afford to be. Of Fenrisians has grown up on a world, that of Fenrisians has grown up on a world that is actively trying to kill them, and they are all still here. They organize themselves into warrior tribes. They sail between islands in wooden dragon ships. They fight each other constantly over territory and honor and resources. Because that is simply the rhythm of life on a world where resources are always scarce and safety is always temporary. And somewhere in the back of every Fenrisian's mind, in the oldest and most foundational layer of their mythology, there is the understanding that the greatest fate available to them is to become one of the Sky Warriors, to be found worthy by the Space Wolves, to be taken up to the Fang, and to join the chapter that stands as Fenris's greatest export. And the Fang itself is worth describing, because nothing quite like it exists anywhere else in the Imperium. It is the Space Wolves' fortress monastery, built into and around the tallest peak of the Asahheim mountain range, which occupies the only stable landmass on the planet. And when I say built into the mountain, I mean the entire mountain, the entire thing, from the deep underground geothermal reactors through the vast inhabited halls and forges and barracks all the way to the very peak, which pierces the atmosphere entirely and terminates in orbital docks where the chapter's warships moor. It is, outside of the Imperial Palace on Terra itself, considered the most impregnable fortress in the Imperium. Anti-ship laser batteries are concealed in neighboring peaks. Its void shields are stronger than those on the mightiest warships. Kilometers of reinforced adamantine corridors connect its various levels, and the whole structure is lit by geothermal energy drawn from Fenris's volcanic core. The Space Wolves call it the Aet, which in their dialect means something like clan home or den. Outside the chapter, everyone calls it the Fang. Both names are right. It is both the greatest fortress ever built on Fenris and the place where warriors go home. The chapter that occupies this fortress is unlike any other in the Imperium. The Space Wolves do not follow the Codex Astartes. Yeah, the organizational manual that most Space Marine chapters treat as something between doctrine and Holy Scripture. They never have, and they are not going to start. Instead of 10 companies of 100 Marines each, they field 12 great companies of varying sizes, each one a fully self-sufficient army with its own ships, forges, equipment, and traditions. Each great company is led by a wolf lord, and above all of them sits the great wolf, the chapter master, who leads the whole organization with the same blend of iron authority and personal charisma that their primarch used to lead the original legion. Their gene seed carries something called the Canis helix, a mutation that causes the warriors who receive it to develop certain wolf-like traits, enhanced senses, a tendency toward pack behavior, physical characteristics that make them look a little more feral than your standard Space Marine, and sometimes more dramatically. It causes full-blown physical transformation into something that is neither Space Marine nor human, a wolfen, a creature of immense strength and pure instinct that remembers what it was, but can no longer quite be it. The Space Wolves deal with this reality with their characteristic directness. They acknowledge it. They integrate it into their culture as something sacred and terrible in equal measure, and they carry on. Leman Russ, their primarch, shaped all of this. He arrived on Fenris as an infant, crash-landed in a survival pod, scattered by the forces that disrupted the Emperor's great project, and was found and raised by Fenrisian wolves. He grew up wild, learned to speak human language from the locals, who eventually accepted him as their king. And when the Emperor came to Fenris to reunite with the son he had been seeking, what he found was not a polished general or a scholar warrior, but a man who ate with wolves and fought with the same terrifying, a joyful ferocity that every Fenrisian tribe valued above all else. The Emperor brought him into the project, gave him his legion, and Leman Russ led the Space Wolves through the Great Crusade as one of the most feared and effective fighting forces in history, carrying out the Emperor's justice across the stars with an enthusiasm that made even other Space Marines a little nervous. This is the world that produced Bjorn. This is the culture that shaped him. A world where survival is victory, where the cold kills the weak, where the highest calling is to stand with your brothers against whatever the darkness sends next, and where the greatest honor is to die doing exactly that. It is worth keeping that in mind as we follow his story, because the central tragedy of Bjorn's existence is not that he has lived too long. It is that, for a warrior raised in that culture, living too long without closure is in some ways worse than death. Section 3. A young wolf among the stars. The Great Crusade. The first thing you need to know about young Bjorn is that he was not, at the beginning of his recorded story, anybody particularly important. He was a grey hunter, a standard rank Space Marine, in Tra, the third great company of the Space Wolves Legion. His commanding officer was a Jarl named Ogvai Helmschrot, and Bjorn's role was what it was for most Space Marines at that level: fight, survive, fight again. Earn your reputation through accumulated deeds and hope that your saga is interesting enough that the Skalds bother to write it down. He was notable for being sullen. He was quick to irritation. He had black braided hair and the kind of intensity that makes people give you a wide berth at social gatherings, which Bjorn probably preferred anyway. His first recorded appearance in Imperial records is almost comedic in how unheroic it is. Bjorn shot down a shuttle. Not an enemy shuttle. A shuttle carrying a remembrancer. One of the civilian artists and historians the crusade employed to document everything for posterity. The man's name was Caspar Horsa, a scholar and conservator, and he had been assigned to Tra Company to record their deeds. Bjorn, either through genuine error or excessive vigilance depending on which account you read, destroyed the man's transport as it approached. Horsa survived somehow. Ed and Bjorn, as punishment for his mistake, was assigned as the man's personal guardian. This was not a glamorous duty. Babysitting civilians was about as far from the glorious sagas of warrior culture as it was possible to get, and Bjorn's attitude toward the assignment could charitably be described as unenthusiastic. He rescued Horsa from a tribal dispute on Fenris with barely concealed resentment. Yet he took the man under his protection with the air of someone performing a task they find deeply beneath them. Horsa, for his part, called Bjorn Bear, a low Gothic translation of his name, and found the space wolf confusing, intimidating, and intermittently fascinating. What neither of them fully appreciated at the time was that this relationship was going to change both of their lives. Horsa eventually became the Skjald, the saga keeper, of Bjorn's own company, while one of the most important positions in Space Wolves culture. And in the short term, Bjorn's assignment as his guardian placed him in the right place at the right time for a series of events that would define everything that followed. The Great Crusade itself was, at this point, still in its extraordinary prime. The Emperor's project to reunify humanity under a single banner, to push back the darkness that had gathered during the Age of Strife and reclaim the stars, but was moving forward with extraordinary momentum. World after world was brought into compliance. Alien civilizations were shattered or absorbed. The legions marched from star to star, leaving order in their wake. The Space Wolves participated in all of this with their characteristic enthusiasm. But they were also beginning to develop a particular reputation as the Emperor's executioners. The force you sent not to conquer, but to punish, as to make an example that other potential dissidents would remember. Bjorn fought in the campaign against the Olamic Quietude, a Xenos civilization that had woven itself so deeply into the human populations, it had conquered that extraction and elimination were essentially the same thing. He was present at Nicaea, where the Emperor held his great council to determine what should be done about psychic powers among the legions. A debate that would have enormous and terrible consequences in the years that followed. He fought alongside his brothers on a dozen worlds whose names the records preserve, but whose people are long since gone. Through all of this, Bjorn was building a reputation, not for speeches or strategic genius or political maneuvering, but for the simple, undeniable quality that the Space Wolves have always valued most. When the fighting got worst, Bjorn got better. Where other warriors hesitated or fell back, Bjorn pressed forward. He was, at his core, a weapon that happened to think, and the thinking part mostly concerned itself with identifying the most direct route to the enemy and taking it. There are accounts that suggest Bjorn was also, beneath the sullen exterior, a more complicated person than he appeared, as he had something like loyalty that went beyond duty. When he formed attachments to Horsa, to his pack brothers, eventually to Leman Russ himself, those attachments ran deep. He did not express this in the kind of warm, open way that some of his brothers did, but it was there, and when he lost people, it hit him harder than almost anything else could. It is worth pausing on the Horsa relationship for a moment, because it tells you something important about Bjorn that the battle records alone cannot. Horsa was not a warrior. He was a scholar, an intellectual, someone whose value to the world was entirely different from the kind of value that the Space Wolves culture normally prioritized. By rights, Bjorn should have found him irrelevant at best and an irritating liability at worst. The assignment to guard him should have been a temporary annoyance, quickly forgotten once the situation resolved. Yet instead, the relationship persisted. Horsa became the Skjald of Bjorn's company, the saga keeper, the person who would record and transmit the chapter of history that Bjorn and his brothers were living through. This is not a small role in Space Wolves culture. The Skjalds are the memory of the chapter, the ones who carry forward everything that would otherwise be lost. Bjorn accepted this arrangement, which means something about the space he had made for Horsa in his thinking. More than that, he protected the man. When situations arose that put Horsa in danger, and in a legion at war, situations like that arose constantly, Bjorn was consistently the one who showed up. He would have denied this meant anything, of course. He would have pointed to the assignment, the duty, the obligation. But the sources that cover this period capture Horsa's perspective too, and what Horsa saw was not a reluctant guardian performing a chore. What he saw was someone who had, as in the wordless and unsentimental way that Fenrisians apparently form bonds, decided that Horsa mattered. The Great Crusade moved from triumph to triumph in this period, but there were currents beneath the surface that only retrospect has made visible. The relationship between Leman Russ and Horus, the two Primarchs who were in many ways the most powerful personalities in the galaxy, was complex and loaded with politics that would eventually tear everything apart. On the role of psykers in the legions was a debate that was heating up toward the confrontation at Nicaea, where the Emperor would have to decide whether to regulate or prohibit the use of psychic powers among his warriors. The relationship between the Space Wolves and the Thousand Sons was already strained. They were opposite poles in almost every way, the warriors of ice and instinct set against the scholars of fire and intellect, and the tension between them had been building for decades. Bjorn was not a political figure. He was not particularly interested in the arguments that were shaping the destiny of the galaxy around him. He had his pack, his duties, his obligations, and his deepening private respect for the man who commanded his legion. That was enough, or should have been enough. The politics would come for him, regardless of his interest in them, as they come for everyone eventually. What he could not have known, and training and fighting and watching Horsa scratch his observations into whatever recording medium skulls used in those days, was that the things he was building, the trust, the bonds, the quiet loyalty, were about to be tested in ways that would make every previous challenge look trivial. The heresy was coming. Everyone in the galaxy could feel it, even if nobody could name it yet. There was a wrongness in the warp that the rune priests spoke of quietly, among themselves, is in the language of bad omens and troubling auguries. The campaigns continued, the compliance operations proceeded. On the surface, everything was still moving forward, but something had begun to rot at the center of the greatest human achievement in history. And when it finally burst, it would take the age with it. This is where Bjorn's story shifts from remarkable to extraordinary, because everything that follows, every impossible stand, every moment of legendary endurance, every battle that should have broken him, is rooted in the person he became during these early years. The sullen, fierce, complicated young grey hunter who shot down a civilian shuttle and then spent years carrying the guilt of that mistake through a galaxy at war. The warrior who lost his pack and became something harder for it. The soldier who loved his Primarch with the inarticulate, burning intensity that only the truly taciturn seem capable of. This is the foundation. And what gets built on it is extraordinary. This is where Bjorn's story shifts from remarkable to extraordinary. Section 4. The burning of Prospero and the birth of the fell-handed. There is a moment that defines a life, sometimes. A pivot point around which everything else arranges itself. What came before and what comes after, divided cleanly. For Bjorn, that moment is a fire. The world of Prospero belonged to the Thousand Sons Legion, the sons of Magnus the Red. It was a world of culture and scholarship, a place where the Thousand Sons had built something genuinely remarkable, an entire civilization organized around the careful, disciplined study of psychic power, wrapped around a great city of glass and gold that gleamed like a jewel among the dead worlds surrounding it. Magnus himself was brilliant, ambitious, arrogant in the specific way that very intelligent people sometimes are, as certain that his understanding of the warp's possibilities justified the risks of using them. He was wrong about the risks, but before history could deliver that verdict, the Council of Nicaea passed its judgment against psychic powers in the legions, and Magnus violated it almost immediately, driven to it, he believed, by the urgency of a warning he needed to deliver to the Emperor about the treachery of Horus. His attempt to breach the wards around the Imperial Palace used sorcery at a scale that shattered countless sanctioned psykers across the legions and left traces across the warp that the Emperor found deeply alarming. The orders that followed were catastrophic in their ambiguity, shaped by the manipulations of a certain warmaster who would soon be revealing his full nature. Leman Russ was sent to bring Magnus to justice, as the message he received pushed him toward bringing a different kind of justice entirely. And so the Space Wolves came to Prospero not to arrest Magnus, but to destroy him, and his world with him. Bjorn was there, in the Third Company, among the thousands of Space Wolf warriors who descended on Prospero like a storm of grey and silver. The city burned. The Thousand Suns fought back with the full weight of their psychic power. And for all its magnificence, the city of Tizca bled and crumbled under the assault. It was a magnificent and terrible thing, and it left scars that would fester for 10,000 years. There is something worth sitting with about this moment in particular. The burning of Prospero is one of the most consequential events in the entire history of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, and the consequences are still playing out in the 42nd Millennium. Magnus the Red survived. His legion survived, transformed and scattered by the sorcery that Tzeentch used as the price of their salvation. Their hatred of the Space Wolves, rooted in this moment of destruction. A destruction that Magnus knows, at some level, was rooted in manipulation and injustice, drives them to this day. The Thousand Suns have attacked Fenris multiple times over the millennia specifically because of what happened here, on Prospero, when the Sons of Russ came with fire and sword. Bjorn was part of that. He was a soldier, following orders in a war whose full shape he could not see. But that does not remove him from it, and the record suggests he has never tried to excuse it either. He was there. He held the burning city in his memory, whatever is left of organic memory after 10,000 years in a machine, and he carries it with the same directness that he carries everything else. But within that broader catastrophe, Bjorn had his own encounter with the darkness, and it was more intimate and more personal than the wholesale destruction happening around him. Caspar Horza, his skjald, his unwanted responsibility, his, and here the sources are careful about the word, his friend, had found himself ensnared by something. Not a Thousand Suns sorcerer, not Magnus himself. Something older and stranger. A demon that had been hiding in the architecture of Prospero's psychic infrastructure for reasons too convoluted to fully unpack here, waiting for the right moment and the right minds to use as its instruments. The demon took the form of Horus. It appeared to Horza in a structure built by the Thousand Suns, wrapped in the face of the Warmaster, and it attempted to work through Horza to destroy the warriors around him. It did this, in part, by reaching into Horza's mind and extracting the true names of the Space Wolves around him. Because in the cosmology of the warp, he knew their names through Horza's thoughts. The daemon used their names against them. One by one, the warriors who came to help fell. The daemon used their names against them. The demon used their names against them. The daemon 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 used their names against them. The demon used their names against them. The daemon 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 used their names against them. The demon 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 used their names against knew their names through Horza's thoughts and memories. And knowing a name gives a demonic entity a handhold on a soul, all except Bjorn. The demon couldn't get Bjorn's name from Horza's mind because Horza had always called him Bear, the low Gothic translation, and had never known his actual name at all. Yet the demon reached for Bjorn and found nothing to grip, and Bjorn, who had no idea why he was still standing when his brothers weren't, did the only thing he knew how to do. He kept hitting. He fought the demon hand to hand while it occupied itself with trying and failing to claim him. He drove it back, blow after blow, refusing to acknowledge anything it tried to do to him. And when it finally grabbed his arm and sent a surge of warp fire through it, burning through flesh and bone and spirit alike, Bjorn still didn't stop. It was Horza who stopped things. Horza who took up an axe and cut Bjorn's arm off at the elbow, preventing the corruption from spreading further through his body. Other accounts say it was Constantin Valdor, chief custodian of the Emperor's personal guard, who performed the amputation. The accounts disagree on the who, they agree on the what. Bjorn lost his arm on Prospero. He hated the name they gave him for it, out initially. The Fell-Handed. He called himself Bjorn the One-Handed instead, in that flat, factual way of his, refusing the poetic framing. But Leman Russ had other ideas. When Bjorn returned to his Primarch afterward, the story goes that Russ looked at him and said something to the effect of, "Fell-Handed is a better name than One-Handed." Bjorn, characteristically, replied that it suited, because a fell hand was one that had been taken, and that stood for all of them. But for everything the crusade was beginning to cost. It is, if you think about it, a quietly profound thing to say. The name that marks the moment of his most visible wound was accepted not as a sign of loss, but as a reminder that loss was shared. That the price being paid was paid collectively, and that the scars were a record of what they had all gone through together. The aftermath of Prospero brought more immediate dangers. In the Battle of the Alaxes Nebula, the Space Wolves found themselves ambushed by the Alpha Legion, the most duplicitous and labyrinthine of all the traitor legions, masters of misdirection and infiltration who struck from angles nobody had thought to defend. Bjorn fought aboard his ship the Hellridder against Alpha Legion boarding parties, cut a path through the chaos to Russ's flagship the Hrafnkel, and helped pull his Primarch back from the edge of despair that was threatening to consume him. That last detail is significant. In the aftermath of Prospero, of realizing what he had done and how thoroughly he had been manipulated into doing it, Leman Russ had fallen into something dark.
Okay, I have to just stop here for a second and be honest with you, because Bjorn is one of those characters that genuinely got to me when I first deep on his lore. Like, on paper, he's a walking tank that has been blowing things up for 10,000 years. And that should just be cool action stuff. But the more you read, the more you realize the whole tragedy of him is that he doesn't think he deserves any of it. He thinks Rus left him behind because he wasn't good enough, and he has carried that for 10 millennia, quietly, while being arguably the most important person in the chapter. That hit me. That genuinely hit me. There's something about a character who just keeps showing up, keeps doing the work, keeps being exactly what everyone needs, while privately believing he's the least worthy person in the room. But anyway, Bjorn is my favorite Dreadnought, and yeah, let's go back to the video.
A crisis of identity and purpose, if you will, questioning whether his role as the Emperor's executioner had been honor or just license for destruction. It was Bjorn who talked him through it. Sullen, short-tempered, supposedly unsentimental Bjorn, who sat with his Primarch in the dark and convinced him that his path was his own to forge, not a sentence handed down from above. Bjorn was good at carrying loss. He had practice, and he was learning at this point that carrying loss well is sometimes the most useful skill a warrior can have. Section 5. Demon King and the Lone Wolf Oath, Grith and the Slaying of Arvax. The Horus Heresy is, in terms of sheer density of catastrophic events, at the most overwhelming period in Warhammer 40,000 lore, and Bjorn was in it, present for battles and decisions and moments that would echo through the next 10 millennia. But the story within the story, the personal thread that matters most for understanding who Bjorn is, happens on a volcanic world called Grith, the pack that Bjorn ran with, his brothers, the warriors he had fought beside through years of campaigning, as the men whose quirks and habits and particular ways of dying had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, went to Grith to deal with a demon. The demon's name was Arvax the Arch-Slaughterer. It was a creature of Khorne, the blood god, a being of immense destructive power that had been wreaking havoc across multiple worlds. Bjorn's pack had faced worse, or thought they had. They had cut through alien civilizations and renegade space marines and the kind of threats that would have destroyed anything less capable. They were experienced warriors in their prime, armed and armored and trained for exactly this kind of work. Every single one of them died except Bjorn. It is important to sit with that for a moment. Not one, not a few, all of them. Bjorn's entire pack, the people who formed the core of his life as a space marine. And his brothers, in the most meaningful sense the space wolves use that word, were killed by Arvax the Arch-Slaughterer, while Bjorn survived through the same quality that had kept him alive in every impossible situation before. He was harder to kill than anything that had tried to kill him yet. The arrival of Leman Russ and the broader Space Wolves force eventually won the battle, but Arvax escaped, and Bjorn, watching his brothers burn on their funeral pyres, has made a choice that would shape the next phase of his life. He became a lone wolf. In Space Wolves culture, a lone wolf is a warrior who has lost their entire pack and sworn an oath not to rest, not to eat or drink at feasts, not to accept the normal rhythms of life until they have found the enemy responsible and exacted vengeance. It is a sacred state, recognized and honored by the chapter, but it is also a profoundly lonely one by definition, by Psalm. Thus, a lone wolf stands apart from the community of the pack until the oath is fulfilled. They are both respected and set aside, warriors walking with one foot in the land of the living and one in the territory of the dead. Bjorn's oath, specifically, was remarkable in its content. He swore that no ale would pass his lips, that he would not indulge at any feast, that no enemy would stay his wrath until his brothers were avenged, and that he would hunt his quarry across the entire sea of stars. For as long as breath remained in his body. The chapter waited. Bjorn waited. 5 years passed, which by Space Marine standards is not long, but in the context of an active war is quite a stretch of time indeed. Then word came that Arvax had been located. Leman Russ himself led the hunt. He wanted Arvax personally. The Primarch had his own accounting to make with the demon, and his intention was to face it in single combat and finish what had been started on Grith. And as the Wolf King drove through the cornate horde toward his quarry, he witnessed something he had not expected. Bjorn got there first, running alone ahead of the main force, his oath and his grief carrying him faster than anything else could. Bjorn reached Arvax before the Primarch did. And what happened next? Russ watched from a short distance away, unable to intervene in time, even if he had wanted to. Bjorn rolled under a blow that should have cut him in half. Yet he found purchase on the daemon's enormous frame and climbed it, physically, hand over hand, until he was at the throat of something that had killed his entire world. And then he used his wolf claw, the weapon that had been his signature, the instrument of 100 previous victories, to tear the arch-slaughterer's throat out. Arvax died. The lone wolf oath was fulfilled. Leman Russ came to Bjorn afterward in front of the entire assembled chapter, and he did something that the Wolf King rarely did. He exonerated Bjorn publicly, declared the oath fulfilled, and then did something that almost never happened on that scale. He elevated Bjorn on the spot to his personal wolf guard, the Einherjar, the Primarch's hand-picked companions and bodyguards, the most honored position in the chapter. He also gave him the name he had apparently been refusing. The Fell-Handed, not one-handed, not maimed, fell-handed, which carried the weight of everything that name had come to mean: the loss, the survival, the oath, the fulfillment. Bjorn accepted it this time. In the years that followed, he went everywhere. The Horus Heresy took the Space Wolves. He stood with Russ at the Battle of Urant, where the Primarch was so badly wounded that he gave Bjorn the Spear of Russ and command of the Legion in what seemed like a final moment. He was at Trisolian. He was at the siege of Terra's aftermath. But he fought and bled and carried on. And the wolf guard that surrounded Russ became, more and more, something that Bjorn thought of as his family, the pack that had replaced the one he had lost. He had no idea that he was about to lose this one too. Section 6. The Long Goodbye. Russ departs, Bjorn leads. The Horus Heresy ended. The Emperor was broken, entombed upon a machine that would sustain him indefinitely in a state between life and death. Horus was dead. The traitor legions scattered into exile. The Imperium, battered and shaking, began the enormous and painful process of rebuilding itself. Bjorn threw himself into this work. He had seen what the war had cost, and the intensity with which he approached the reconstruction period was, according to the sources that cover it, remarkable even by Space Wolves standards. He trained new warriors, planned campaigns against the scattered remnants of Chaos forces, yet contributed to the scouring that hunted down the traitors. He was, in this period, everything a chapter's most senior warrior should be: experienced, driven, deeply committed to the project of making the Imperium whole again. All of which is why what came next hit him so hard. In the year 211 of the 31st Millennium, almost 200 years after the Emperor's entombment, Leman Russ gathered the Space Wolves for a feast at the Fang. The Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, one of the great ceremonial occasions, a celebration and remembrance all in one. Every great company was present, every wolf lord. The great hall was full of warriors and noise, and the kind of rough, joyful celebration that the Space Wolves had always been good at. Leman Russ stood up to speak, and then something happened to him that nobody who was there has ever fully been able to describe. His eyes went distant. He fell to his knees. He looked, by all accounts, like a man receiving a vision of such magnitude that the physical world had temporarily ceased to exist for him. He gathered his wolf guard, his closest companions, the warriors who had been at his side through everything. He gave them his instructions, spoke words that the sources don't fully record, and then stood and left the great hall to journey toward a destination that nobody else in the room knew. He left one warrior behind, the youngest member of his guard. The most junior, in terms of time, served in that role. The one who had spent 5 years as a lone wolf fulfilling an oath of vengeance and joined the Wolf Guard only relatively recently. The one who understood, better than any of the others, what it meant to carry loss with patience and purpose. He left Bjorn, the Fell-Handed. Nobody knows what passed between them before Russ walked away. The sources are silent on this point, possibly because Bjorn has never been willing to speak about it in detail. What the records do preserve is the aftermath. Bjorn, standing alone in a great hall that had been full of celebration moments before, watching his Primarch's back disappear through the door, with no explanation given and no farewell offered. There is a piece of lore attached to this moment that is, I think, genuinely heartbreaking if you think about it. What the skjalds of the chapter hold that Russ made this choice deliberately, specifically because Bjorn was the warrior who could endure being left behind. Of all the Wolfguard, he alone had already lived through catastrophic loss and come through it intact. He alone had demonstrated, through the lone wolf years, that he could carry grief without being destroyed by it. Russ chose Bjorn to stay, not as a slight, but as the highest possible expression of trust in Bjorn's strength. Bjorn has never been able to accept this interpretation. To this day, when he speaks of this moment, his voice, mechanical now, filtered through Dreadnought voxcasters, carries a weight that observers consistently describe as barely suppressed anguish. He feels that he was left behind. He cannot entirely shake the conviction that there was something in him that Russ found wanting, some flaw that made him unsuitable to bring along on whatever final journey the Wolf King undertook. And Russ never told him, never explained, just left. The Space Wolves waited 7 years for their Primarch to return. Every year at the Great Feast, his place was set, his drinking horn was filled. They waited because Russ had said he would return. At the wolf time, at the end of days, he would come back. 7 years of waiting, and then the Wolf Lords convened and made a decision. They elected Bjorn, the first great wolf. And he led the chapter on the first great hunt, the search for their lost Primarch that has been repeated in various forms ever since. All 12 great companies spread across the stars, pursuing every rumor and lead, hunting through this dimension and the next for some sign of where Leman Russ had gone. And Bjorn himself, true to his nature, went to the most dangerous place he could think of. He led his search into the Eye of Terror, or the great warp rift where the traitor legions had retreated and where reality itself was at best an approximation. It was there that he was wounded beyond the ability of his apothecaries to repair. The sources are sparse on the specifics. It takes a great deal to inflict permanent damage on a space marine of Bjorn's caliber, but whatever he encountered in the Eye of Terror managed it. His body was too broken to sustain itself. The chapter brought him back to the Fang. And there the decision was made. He was to be interred in a Dreadnought. Section 7, Steel and Eternity. Interment in the Dreadnought. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, a Dreadnought is many things depending on who you ask. To the Mechanicus, it is a Walker-class combat vehicle of great antiquity and utility. To the chapter that fields one, it is something more. It is a war machine that contains a person, in a sarcophagus that preserves a warrior too important to lose and too broken to survive without it. The warrior inside is connected to the machine through bionics and life support systems, their consciousness interfaced with the machine's sensors and weapons, their organic remains sustained in a kind of permanent wounded state within the armored shell. For Bjorn, this was not an honor he welcomed. There are no recorded protests, no dramatic objection. Yet he was not in any condition to protest when it happened, if we are being factual about it. What the record does show is the person who emerged on the other side of the process, and how he thought about what had been done to him. The short version is that he was furious, not at the chapter, not at the decision itself, which was made out of devotion to him. He was furious at the circumstances that had made it necessary, at the galaxy for being the kind of place that destroyed people, at Leman Russ for not being there to see it happen, at time itself for the grinding, relentless way it consumed everything he cared about. The bitterness that the sources describe in the early Dreadnought period is not the bitterness of ingratitude. It is the bitterness of someone who has lost, over and over again, the things that made life feel like living, and who now finds himself preserved in a form that will apparently allow this to continue more or less indefinitely. And he also reportedly found the decorations on his sarcophagus extremely irritating. The Iron Priests and the warriors of the chapter had covered his Dreadnought chassis in honors and laurels and symbols of his achievements, because they revered him and wanted the machine that housed him to reflect that reverence. Bjorn has been described as consistently contemptuous of this ornamentation, viewing it as a kind of lie about who he is, because he believes, at a deep and private level, that he does not deserve the reverence. He was the one Russ left behind. He was the one who lost his pack. Whatever was accomplished happened in spite of those losses, not as a celebration of anything he did right. This is worth pausing on, because it says something important about the character. Bjorn has been building his story from moments of survival rather than moments of triumph. He was the one who did not die at Grith. He was the one Russ did not take with him. But he was the one who was preserved when his body finally gave out, rather than being allowed the clean end of a warrior's death. Every major chapter of his life is defined, at some level, by outlasting something that should have ended him. In spite of all this, the early centuries of his Dreadnought existence were, by any external measure, extraordinary. The records note that after his interment, Bjorn spent approximately 500 years at the forefront of the chapter's battles. Of 5 centuries of continuous campaign, fighting as a Dreadnought, leading the chapter through everything the post-heresy galaxy threw at it. His kill count from this period is estimated to exceed that of some entire chapters. The Dreadnought chassis he inhabited was, even then, one of the most technically advanced in existence, capable of faster movement and reaction times than you would expect from something its size, able to fight on instinct rather than protocol. The weapon built for his Dreadnought form deserves particular mention. When Bjorn was first entombed, the Iron Priests of the chapter faced an interesting challenge. How do you honor a warrior's fighting style when the warrior's body has been replaced with a machine? Bjorn's signature weapon in his mortal life had been a wolf claw, a lightning claw, in more technical terminology, as a weapon that generates a field of disruptive energy around bladed fingers and allows a warrior to cut through almost anything. The Iron Priests built him one. Scaled up to Dreadnought size, it became what is now called True Claw, an ancient and revered relic of the chapter, a massive lightning claw that fits the proportions of his machine frame the way the original fit his mortal hand. He still fights with it. 10,000 years later, True Claw is still the weapon Bjorn uses when the fighting gets close. There is something almost elegiac about this continuity, that the defining style of the warrior who died at the Proxima Rebellion is preserved in the weapon that the machine wields 10 millennia later. The 5 centuries of active combat after his interment were not comfortable exactly. Nothing about being a Dreadnought is comfortable in the way that a mortal life provides comfort, but they were purposeful. And purpose was something Bjorn had always been able to draw on. The chapter needed him. There were enemies to be destroyed, and he was extraordinarily good at destroying them. What changed eventually was not his capability, but his sustainability. The organic components of his mind, the flesh that still floated inside the sarcophagus, kept alive by machines, interfaced with the Dreadnought systems, required increasing periods of rest. The stasis cycles grew longer. The active periods grew shorter, relatively speaking. The chapter adapted, building their care around Bjorn's rhythms, rather than trying to impose other rhythms on him. There is a meditation in one of the older Space Wolves texts, attributed to a rune priest who studied Bjorn during one of his more communicative awakened periods, that captures something of the texture of this existence. The priest describes Bjorn as a man who lives in islands of time, separated by seas of nothing. Yet each awakening is its own complete experience, disconnected from the last by the darkness of stasis, and in the gap between islands the world continues turning without him. He emerges to find new faces wearing familiar armor markings, new enemies carrying the same old hatreds, new versions of crises that have never entirely been solved. The priest asked Bjorn once how he maintained a sense of continuous identity under these conditions. The answer, reportedly, was characteristic in its brevity. "I remember Russ. Not as an explanation of spiritual sustenance or metaphysical anchoring. Just that. 3 words. I remember Russ. The chapter took that to mean something profound, which it probably was, but it also reveals the shape of Bjorn's inner landscape more clearly than anything more elaborate could. His continuity of self runs through his connection to the Wolf King, whatever he is, Bjorn the Fell-Handed, as that identity is held together by the gravitational force of a relationship with someone who left, who has not returned, who promised to return, and has not yet done so. 10,000 years of waiting compressed into 3 words. I remember Russ. Eventually, the long years truly did take their toll on the ancient warrior, and the intervals between battles stretched from decades to centuries. The chapter adjusted, and the rituals of care and awakening became part of the Fang's architecture, as fundamental as its defensive systems. And Bjorn, ancient beyond any easy comprehension, found the shape of his remaining existence. Sleep, wake, serve, sleep again. A cycle of service and rest that stretches toward a horizon he believes, has always believed, will eventually resolve into something worth all the waiting. Armor's Section 8, Against the Crimson King. The Battle of the Fang. The year is approximately the 32nd millennium. 1,000 years have passed since the Horus Heresy. The Imperium has survived its near-death experience and emerged into something that has learned to sustain itself through force and faith, through the raw, stubborn persistence of a species that refuses to accept extinction as an outcome. The space wolves are still here, the Fang still stands. And somewhere in its deepest chambers, Bjorn the Fell-Handed sleeps. He would not sleep undisturbed for much longer. Harek Ironhelm was the great wolf of the space wolves at this time, and he was consumed by something. For years, Magnus the Red, the demon primarch of the Thousand Suns, the architect of Prospero's burning and the burning's consequence, had appeared to him in visions. Magnus taunting him, Magnus walking through ruins of his own making, Magnus always just out of reach. Ironhelm had spent decades in a state of obsession that the chapter's records describe with the careful language of people who love their leader and are genuinely worried about him, hunting for Magnus across the eye of Terra's edges, finding only smoke and misdirection. And then he found what he believed to be the Thousand Suns base, a world called Gangava, where chaos forces aligned with Magnus had made their presence obvious. Ironhelm launched an assault without hesitation. At 11 great companies, nearly the entire chapter, plunged into the battle at Gangava. It was a trap. Magnus had arranged this specifically. Gangava was real, and the chaos forces there were real, and the battle was real, but the whole point of it was to draw the bulk of the Space Wolves away from their home. Because while 11 great companies were committed to fighting at Gangava, the entire Thousand Suns fleet arrived at Fenris. One great company remained to defend the Fang. One company. Their serfs, their mortal soldiers, and a handful of the chapter's most ancient warriors, including Bjorn. He was awakened by orders from Wolf Lord Vare Greylock, the officer commanding the Fang's skeleton garrison, and given the tactical situation. The briefing was, by all accounts, not a comfortable one. The Fang was facing the full weight of the Thousand Suns Legion, backed by Mechanicus automatons and the Chaos Fleet, with a fraction of the defenders that any military assessment would have called minimally sufficient. Bjorn was irritated at not having been consulted earlier, irritated at Ironhelm for taking the bait, and ready to fight. For weeks, the battle raged. Bjorn was everywhere, identifying tactical problems, neutralizing threats that the garrison's more limited warriors couldn't handle, and carrying the defense through moments that should have broken it. Well, when the Thousand Suns deployed cataphract war robots against the defenders, it was Bjorn who stepped in to deal with them. His Dreadnought frame and ancient weapon systems more than equal to the mechanical threat. Throughout the siege, his presence was the single most stabilizing factor in a defense that should, mathematically, have already failed. And then Magnus arrived in person, not as a distant commander directing his forces from orbit. Magnus the Red, demon primarch of the Thousand Suns, or was in full physical manifestation, materialized in the upper levels of the Fang itself. His arrival was felt by everyone in the fortress. The rune priests felt it as a sickening psychic pressure, a wrongness in the warp that was physically nauseating. But for Bjorn, deep in the fortress, the sensation was different. He recognized it. 1,000 years. 1,000 years since Prospero, since the fire and the daemon and the arm, since the day that Magnus's legion had burned a world and set in motion everything that followed. And now, Magnus was here, in the Fang, and the part of Bjorn that had been carrying that weight for all this time made a decision that no amount of tactical calculation could have generated. He went after him. He moved through the Fang's corridors as fast as his massive frame could manage, driving toward the source of that psychic presence with the same inexorable purpose he had brought to every confrontation that mattered. He arrived too late to stop Magnus from completing his primary objective. The destruction of the chapter's gene seed research, the work of Wolf Lord Thar on developing Space Wolf's successor, Chapter Gene Seed, a project that Magnus destroyed utterly and whose loss meant the Space Wolves would never produce descendant chapters. But Bjorn caught up to Magnus, and what happened next is one of the most extraordinary single combats in the 40,000 years of the setting. They dueled from a hangar bay out onto the open mountainside of the Fang itself. Bjorn, inside his Dreadnought chassis, ancient and enormous, and driven by 1,000 years of memory, against Magnus, the Red, in physical manifestation, a demon Primarch, a being of sorcery and impossible power, one of the most dangerous individuals in the galaxy. And Bjorn was hitting him, not symbolically, not heroically futile. Bjorn was actually injuring Magnus with both fire and blade, striking blows that the Thousand Sons Primarch had not absorbed at that level since the Horus Heresy itself. The sources describe it as the greatest damage Magnus had taken in 1,000 years. A Dreadnought versus a Demon Primarch, and the Dreadnought was winning points in the exchange. Magnus destroyed both of Bjorn's weapon arms, literally tore them away or disabled them, stripping the Dreadnought of its offensive capability. Bjorn did not stop. He kept trying to push Magnus off the cliff they were fighting on, using his armored frame as a battering ram when the weapons were gone. Magnus paused to recognize what he was looking at. The soul of the warrior who had faced him and his forces at Prospero, scarred by that encounter in ways that were still visible to a being of Magnus's perception, as still present and still fighting all these centuries later. He was preparing to kill Bjorn when Harek Ironhelm arrived. The Great Wolf had broken from the deception at Gangava and returned with all speed, his drop pod literally impacting on the peak of the Fang in a last-second intervention. He fought Magnus on the mountain slope, and the battle that followed cost him his life. Magnus slew Ironhelm before finally retreating from a physical form that had been too badly damaged to maintain. The Thousand Sons withdrew. The Fang survived. Bjorn survived too, badly damaged, pulled from the fight when Ironhelm's arrival struck all three combatants from the cliff. He spent time in the Iron Priest's care before being returned to stasis. But the damage he had inflicted on Magnus was real, and it stood as a testament to something the chapter would speak of for centuries afterward. The Fell-Handed, deep in stasis for 1,000 years, woken to defend his home, yet had hurt a demon Primarch worse than anyone had managed since before the heresy. The wound to the chapter went deep too. The gene seed research was gone. There would be no Space Wolf's successor chapter. The knowledge of how to reproduce Space Wolf gene seed was lost with Hraldir. It remains lost today, which is why there is only one Space Wolves chapter, and always has been, and why the chapter that exists is, in a very real sense, the last of its kind. To Section 9, The Peacemaker. The Months of Shame. The year is 444 of the 41st Millennium. The First War for Armageddon has just concluded, and the Imperium is in the process of doing what it sometimes does after a significant victory, turning on itself. Armageddon was a hive world that endured an invasion of extraordinary violence, led by the demon Primarch Angron. Horn's Chosen, the former World Eater's Primarch, and a being of such savage power that even the combined forces of the Space Wolves and the Grey Knights had struggled to deal with him. The war had been terrifying, the casualties immense, and the victory hard won. It took 109 Grey Knights teleporting directly into the center of Angron's demonic army to finally banish him, and most of those Grey Knights died in the process. A young Grey Knight named Hyperion, drawing on psychic reserves he barely knew he had, managed to shatter Angron's Black Blade, the Daemon Primarch's primary weapon, in a feat of such extraordinary power that the Space Wolves, who respect very few things outside their own chapter, gave him the title Bladebreaker and have used it ever since. The war itself, brutal as it was, had been comprehensible. The Space Wolves and the Grey Knights and the Armageddon Steel Legion had fought together against a shared enemy, and they had won. The machinery of Imperial war, for all its horror, had worked as intended. Angron was banished back to the warp for 100 years. The Chaos Forces were routed. The world was saved. And then the Inquisition arrived to save it from the people who had saved it. The problem, from the Ordo Malleus's perspective, was knowledge. The Imperial Guard regiments who had fought on Armageddon knew things. They had seen Demon Primarchs and Grey Knights and the full, overwhelming reality of chaos. While they had fought in battles where the existence of the ruinous powers was not an abstract theological concept, but a lived experience. The general population of Armageddon had been exposed to the same, and the Inquisition's calculation, Lord Inquisitor Gesme Kisnaros's calculation specifically, was that this knowledge was too dangerous to leave in circulation. The price of letting it spread was, in his assessment, too high, so the survivors were to be processed. The guard regiments were to be tracked down and their personnel sterilized, their memories altered, their remaining years spent in labor camps doing useful work until they died off. The civilian population was to undergo similar measures. Everything exposed to the events of Armageddon was to be contained. This was not, from a certain cold-blooded utilitarian perspective, an entirely unreasonable position. The Inquisition's whole mandate included exactly this kind of containment. Yet the secrets they kept and the measures they took to keep them were, in many cases, genuinely necessary for the stability of a civilization that could not afford mass panic about the nature of the forces opposing it. Logan Grimnar was not in a cold-blooded utilitarian mood. The great wolf of the Space Wolves had watched his chapter's warriors fight alongside the Imperial Guard on Armageddon. He had seen those soldiers give everything they had, their courage, their skill. It would have shattered most forces, and Keep would have shattered most forces, and keep fighting in the knowledge that the enemy they faced was something their theology told them could not exist, and their eyes told them was right there. These people had served the Emperor faithfully. They had earned whatever the Imperium offered its defenders. What they were being offered was a work camp. Grimnar could not accept this. Not theoretically, not in principle, not in practice. He began using the chapter's resources to protect survivors, moving Imperial Guard units to places the Inquisition wasn't looking, finding ways to complicate the containment operations, making the systematic purge considerably less systematic. The Inquisition pushed back. The Space Wolves pushed harder. The conflict escalated from Cold War to Hot War in stages, at each escalation pulling more resources and more lives into something that none of the original participants had intended when they set out for Armageddon. Entire worlds caught fire in the crossfire. Inquisition forces hunted down troop transports carrying Armageddon survivors, destroying ships in the warp, condemning everyone aboard. The Space Wolves fought to intercept and protect. 3 Imperial Navy warships were eventually destroyed in orbit over Fenris when the conflict reached its peak, their burning hulks crashing into the Fang and causing damage that the sources describe as exceeding what the Thousand Suns had inflicted during the Battle of the Fang itself. The machinery of the Imperium, fractured but functional, was tearing itself apart over a disagreement about what to do with the people who had saved one of its most important planets. It was, from any perspective, a catastrophe, and someone needed to make it stop. They woke up Bjorn. While the awakening ritual was performed under emergency conditions, without the ceremony that normally attended it. The Iron Priests worked quickly, coaxing consciousness back into the ancient warrior with the focused urgency of people who know they are out of time. And when Bjorn came online, in that cold, frost-rimed chamber, he was given the situation in full. A fleet in orbit. One damaged Space Wolf strike cruiser in response, the Fang intact but isolated. The whole chapter scattered across the galaxy on missions that had, in retrospect, been calculated to ensure exactly this scenario. And two Imperium-aligned forces burning through each other's assets over a question of principle that had already cost billions of lives in collateral damage. The inquisitorial delegation arrived at the Fang expecting to negotiate submission. What they found instead was something they had not prepared for. Picture this moment, as the sources describe it. Hyperion, the blade breaker, who had spent months in the months of shame, reluctantly participating in operations he found morally repugnant, who carried the weight of his order's actions in this conflict and found it profoundly uncomfortable. He walked into the Fang alongside Kisnaros and Inquisitor Jarlsdottir. He was ready, or as ready as he could be, for a Space Wolf's representative. He expected someone angry. He expected someone difficult. He knew the Space Wolf's reputation. But he was not ready for Bjorn. There are some authorities you earn by rank, and some you earn by deed. And then there is the authority that is simply intrinsic, that exists as a property of the thing itself, rather than of anything it has accomplished or been given. When Bjorn the Fell-Handed was present in a room, he was the oldest living space marine in the Imperium, a warrior who had stood with the Emperor before the Inquisition as an institution had even been conceived. And every Grey Knight who walked into that hall had grown up studying the events that Bjorn had lived through as a young man. Their founding, their mission, their entire reason for existing was rooted in a history that Bjorn had been present for. And here he was, encased in 10,000 years of metal, looking at them through optics that had watched worlds burn since before their order was born. Both sides, reportedly, stopped. Not because anyone commanded it, because you do not walk into the presence of something like that and maintain the posture of a man who has all the answers. Even Kisnaros, who had come with ultimatums and contingencies and the conviction that his position was righteous, found himself in a different register than he had planned for. Bjorn rejected Kisnaros's terms. Full stop. The Inquisitor had arrived with an ultimatum: submit to a penitent crusade, or all consequences, and Bjorn declined it on behalf of the chapter with the flat, factual certainty of someone who has been deciding things for 10,000 years and is very comfortable with the weight of it. Then he offered his own terms. The Inquisition fleet would leave Fenris orbit and would not return. Any Inquisition vessel that subsequently appeared in Fenris's skies was to be destroyed without warning. The Space Wolves who had gained knowledge of the Grey Knight's existence during the conflict would not be mind-wiped, as was the Inquisition's normal practice when their secrets were accidentally revealed. Instead, Hyperion himself, the blade breaker, the warrior both sides respected, would come down to the Fang and explain his order's purpose and necessity to every Space Wolf within its walls, turning accidental exposure into deliberate understanding. The remaining Armageddon survivors were handed back to the Inquisition for processing. It was a compromise, but a compromise on Bjorn's terms rather than Kisnaros's. And it contained, embedded in the condition about Hyperion and the mind wipes, something worth noticing. Bjorn was ensuring that the Space Wolves would remember, not just the Grey Knights, but the whole affair, the betrayal of the soldiers of Armageddon, the months of shame, all of it. As he was building it into the chapter's institutional memory, making sure it would be carried forward. The Space Wolves remember their losses, they carry them, and they do not forgive easily. Grimnar killed Kisnaros. That happened while Bjorn was still negotiating. The Great Wolf boarded the Inquisitor's flagship in the rage that Grimnar has always been subject to, fought his way to the bridge, and decapitated the Inquisitor Lord before anyone could stop him, which should, must by any reasonable assessment, have ended the negotiation and started the war again, in earnest. Instead, Bjorn teleported to the bridge, his first ever use of a teleporter, which he had been avoiding for reasons the sources only speculate about. He materialized on a warship that was currently full of space wolves in killing mode and inquisitorial forces ready to respond in kind, and he told everyone to stop this madness. They stopped. Grimna stood down, Hyperion surveying the situation, and agreed to the terms. The fleet left, and the months of shame, technically speaking, ended, though the scars of it persist in every space wolf who knows the story, and in every Grey Knight who carries the memory of the colleagues lost in that fratricidal disaster. Section 10. The eldest among all. Legacy, significance, and the wolf time. Here we are then, at the 42nd millennium, the age of the Dark Imperium. The Great Rift has opened, splitting the galaxy in half with a river of warp energy that makes interstellar travel and communication in large sections of space somewhere between difficult and impossible. Rabut Gilliman has been resurrected after 10,000 years in stasis and appointed Lord Commander of the Imperium, trying to hold together something that is fraying at every edge. The forces of chaos are everywhere, pressing on every front, and the Imperium is fighting on more fronts simultaneously than any prior age could have imagined. And deep in the Fang, Bjorn sleeps. He will be woken when he is needed. He has always been woken when he is needed, and the galaxy as it currently stands seems entirely capable of generating the kind of need that would justify it. There are those who have theorized, very quietly in the places where such theories can be spoken, that the opening of the Great Rift might itself be the beginning of the wolf time, the end of days that Russ promised to return for. If that is true, then Bjorn may be woken soon and kept awake for the first time in his Dreadnought existence. What does Bjorn mean to the Space Wolves today? The answer to that question has several layers, and they are all worth sitting with. The most obvious layer is tactical. On a venerable Dreadnought of his specification is an extraordinarily capable combat system. The assault cannon that forms one of his primary weapons can tear through infantry and light vehicles with equal efficiency. The True Claw, the Dreadnought-scale lightning claw built to honor his favored weapon from his mortal life, can rip apart almost anything it reaches. His battlefield experience encompasses literally every type of enemy the Imperium has faced in 10,000 years. The tactical database in his systems is unique in the galaxy. When Bjorn fights, his mere presence generates a kind of organizational stability in the warriors around him that no amount of training can replicate, because they are fighting alongside someone who was there at the beginning, and that knowledge changes how you approach the work. The records describe instances where Bjorn has deployed with relatively green space wolves, bloodclaws fresh from their proving, warriors only a decade or two into their service, and observed that their performance in his presence was measurably better than their standard metrics would have predicted, not because of any tactical instruction he provided, because of what it does to a warrior's sense of what is possible to fight beside the oldest living space marine in the galaxy and watch him stride forward without hesitation. If he can still be doing this, the thinking goes, then you can certainly be doing it. But the tactical dimension is almost secondary to the cultural one. For the Space Wolves, Bjorn is the last living connection to Leman Russ. Not a record, not a saga, an actual living mind that actually knew the Wolf King, fought beside him, received direct counsel from him, loved him with the full complexity and frustration and devotion that a warrior of 10,000 years standing can carry. When Bjorn speaks about Russ at the Great Feast, he is not reciting a story, he is reporting a memory. And however much he distrusts his own worthiness to do so, however much his private conviction that Russ left him behind for some failing, remains a wound that never heals. The fact that he can speak at all is extraordinary. Every generation of space wolves that passes through the Fang does so knowing that somewhere beneath their feet, in the cold and the dark, this connection to their origin is being preserved. Every Bloodclaw who takes his oaths does so in a chapter that contains, as one of its members, a warrior who heard those same oaths from Leman Russ's own mouth. The thread of continuity that runs through the Space Wolves chapter is longer than any other chapter can claim, and Bjorn is the reason it has not broken. Consider what this means for the chapter's relationship to its own history. Most Space Marine chapters are separated from their founding by centuries of oral tradition, written records, and the inevitable drift that comes when stories pass through many hands. The Iron Hands know about Ferrus Manus through texts and sagas. The Blood Angels know about Sanguinius through rituals designed to keep his memory vivid despite the distance. The Space Wolves have something none of them have, a primary source. Bjorn is a primary source. He was there. He can and does correct the record when it drifts too far from what he actually experienced. When sagas begin to accrete the kinds of embellishments that make for better stories, but worse history, Bjorn is available, albeit limited in his availability, to say what actually happened. This is an extraordinary thing, and the chapter knows it, which is why the Iron Priests maintain his systems with such extraordinary care, and why the request to wake him is treated with the gravity of something that cannot be done lightly or often. But there is another dimension to Bjorn's persistence that the sources touch on with careful reverence: his spiritual role. Ancient and powerful spirits of the warp are sometimes described as taking interest in Bjorn, and there are accounts suggesting that even in stasis, in the deep sleep that fills the centuries between his awakenings, Bjorn's spirit has been active in a different way, standing vigil over the Fang's reflection in the warp, and defending against demonic attempts to manifest in the Space Wolves' home. The hexagrammic wards on the Fang's walls, maintained and refreshed by generations of rune priests, are reinforced by something that goes beyond the physical, and some accounts credit this to Bjorn's continued presence, even dormant, as a kind of anchor against the warp. This would, if true, or of existence, the machine sustaining the of existence, the machine sustaining the man, and the man sustaining the fortress that the machine calls home. What keeps him going? This is not a simple question, because on the surface, the answer for a warrior of his culture should be easy. You fight until you can't. You keep the oaths. You serve the chapter. These are not complicated ideas. But Bjorn's specific situation is complicated by the fact that he has been doing all of these things for so long that the reasons behind them have had time to develop the kind of texture that only centuries can produce. He is waiting for Russ to come back. This is, ultimately, the gravitational center of Bjorn's existence. Every great feast where he speaks of the Wolf King carries the unspoken weight of waiting. Every battle he fights is, on some level, in keeping faith with a promise that was made by absence rather than word. Russ will return at the wolf time, the final battle, the end of days, and Bjorn has appointed himself the one who will be there when that happens. He is the continuity between the age of the Primarchs and whatever age is coming. He is the hinge. This is why the decorations on his sarcophagus bother him. He is not sure he deserves the honors that have been accumulated around him, and because his self-assessment is filtered through the belief that Russ left him behind as the weakest member of the Wolf Guard, the one least able to be useful on whatever final journey the Primarch undertook. He carries this conviction against all evidence to the contrary, against the accumulated record of 10,000 years of decisive action and irreplaceable service, and it has made him both more remarkable and more difficult than he might otherwise have been. He has been described as trying, and on occasion, to appear increasingly senile when awakened for the great feast, drawing his answers out, letting his voice slow and falter, giving the impression of an ancient mind losing its edge, in the hope that eventually the chapter will decide he has served long enough and let him sleep permanently. The fact that this has not worked, that the chapter can see through it easily enough, that they keep waking him up because they need him, it is something he endures with the weary resignation of someone who has been getting up early against their wishes for 10,000 years. And then something happens. A battle that needs his weapons, a crisis that needs his wisdom, an inquisitorial fleet that needs him to appear on the bridge and tell everyone to calm down. And he does what he always does. He shows up. He does the work. He carries the chapter through it. There is a phrase from the culture Bjorn comes from that describes this kind of stubborn persistence. There is no fate but the one you make. Fenrisian culture, built on a world that kills the unprepared, does not have much room for passivity or resignation. You act, or you die, and the Space Wolves who come from that culture have built the most action-oriented Space Marine chapter in the Imperium, as a result. Bjorn embodies this at its most extreme. He has had every reason, for more than half of the Imperium's history, to simply stop, to accept the rest that his long service has earned, to let the machine wind down and be at peace. He hasn't. He won't. Because Russ hasn't come back yet, and somebody needs to be standing at the gate when he does. On the tabletop, Bjorn translates into one of the most characterful and capable special characters in the Space Wolves' arsenal. In the current edition of the game, he brings legendary tenacity, reducing wound rolls against him when the attacker is stronger than he is, representing that ancient stubbornness that has seen him through 10,000 years of everything the galaxy has thrown at him. His ancient tactician ability generates a command point each turn he is on the battlefield, because having 10,000 years of tactical experience in your corner turns out to be worth something concrete and measurable. And his last of the company of Russ ability extends re-rolls to all Space Wolves within his presence, because the sight of this ancient warrior fighting alongside them changes the calculus of what is possible. He is, in game terms, the Space Wolves' most expensive and most powerful named character, and the community has generally held him in deep affection, partly because of his mechanical effectiveness and partly because of the sheer mythological weight he carries. Oh, forward into battle. You are moving 10 forward into battle. You are moving 10,000 years of stubborn persistence forward into battle. And that is not nothing. There is a prophecy that the Space Wolves carry from generation to generation, spoken at every great feast, renewed with every oath. It is called the Wolf Time. The final battle. The end of days that Leman Russ promised to return for, the apocalyptic conflict that will, in Fenrisian mythology, bring all things to their conclusion. Russ told his warriors he would come back for this. He would fight at their side one more time, in the battle that mattered most. Bjorn believes this. He does not speak of it often, and when he does, it is in the careful, guarded way of someone who has spent 10,000 years carrying a hope that has not yet been vindicated. But the wolf priest Ulrich, one of the oldest active Space Wolves warriors, knows Bjorn well enough to see what drives him. Bjorn will know no peace until he fights alongside his Primarch one more time. He has organized his entire existence around being present for that moment, keeping faith with a promise that was made by someone who has not yet kept it, maintaining the position, staying on guard, being ready. 10,000 years of ready. There is another detail worth noting here. As one, he called for his wolf guard and his one. He called for his wolf guard and his retinue, all save the youngest. He told them things, gave them instructions, and then he left. Only Bjorn remained. The Skjalds say that Russ chose Bjorn precisely because Bjorn had already proven he could carry loss. He had lost his pack on Grith and come through it. He had carried the lone wolf oath to completion. He had been tested in exactly the way that the task of being left behind required, and he had not broken. Russ, who understood his warriors intimately, saw in Bjorn the one person who could endure the abandonment without letting it destroy him. The tragedy is that this understanding, this being chosen for his strength rather than rejected for his weakness, is the exact thing Bjorn cannot see. But he interprets the abandonment as a judgment against him. He cannot separate the form of being left, the wordless departure, the absence of explanation, from the content of what it meant. And so he carries the wound of it still, after 10,000 years, doing the work that the wound itself was meant to enable. The sarcophagus sleeps, the life support hums, somewhere in the deep dark beneath Asserheim, within a fortress that pierces the atmosphere of a world of perpetual winter, something waits. But the youngest Bloodclaw in the chapter today knows his name. The oldest Longfang in the chapter has never seen him wake, and somewhere between those two poles is the living history of the Space Wolves. A warrior who shot down a civilian shuttle, lost his arm to a demon, lost his pack to a worse one, led a chapter through the death of an age, fought a demon Primarch with both arms destroyed and refused to stop, and has been sleeping and waking and sleeping again for so long that his existence alone is a kind of defiance against everything the galaxy has tried to do. The wolf time will come. When it does, Bjorn intends to be there. He has been waiting long enough. He can wait a little longer. And that, friends, is the story of Bjorn the Fell-Handed, one of the most remarkable characters in the entire Warhammer 40k universe, and one of those cases where the mythology and the emotion of the setting come together in a way that just hits differently. There is something about the idea of a warrior who has outlasted everyone he loved, who carries the wound of being left behind for 10,000 years, who genuinely believes he is keeping a vigil that will eventually be rewarded. That speaks to something real and universal, even inside all the science fiction and fantasy armor plating. He is, at the end of the day, a story about waiting, about loyalty that has outlasted its context, about love that has been carrying itself so long it has become indistinguishable from purpose, about an old soldier who does not know how to stop being a soldier, who might not want to stop, but who is absolutely certain of one thing: when the moment that matters finally comes, and he is going to be standing at the gate. What I find most interesting about Bjorn, personally, is the way he complicates what should be a straightforward, heroic narrative. He does not entirely believe he deserves his place in the story. He carries the conviction of his own insufficiency alongside 10,000 years of evidence to the contrary, and he cannot let go of either. He is, in that sense, a deeply human figure, not despite the 10,000 years and the machine body and the extraordinary capabilities, but through them. The scale of his existence makes his very ordinary emotional wound, the wound of being left behind without explanation by someone you loved, more visible, not less. It has had 10,000 years to deepen, to put down roots, to become structural rather than incidental. And yet he fights. He wakes up every time and he does the work. Yet he does not resolve the wound. He does not transcend it through force of will or accumulated wisdom. He just carries it and keeps going, because that is what the Space Wolves do. Because Russ might come back. Because the chapter still needs him. Because the wolf time hasn't come yet, and somebody needs to be at the gate. There is a phrase sometimes attributed to Bjorn himself, though the original source is disputed. The only way out is through. What he did not say this as a piece of philosophy or a motivational statement. He said it, allegedly, in the context of a tactical assessment, referring to a literally blocked exit from a battlefield. But it has been taken up by the chapter's storytellers as something more, because it captures something essential about how Bjorn has moved through 10,000 years of loss and waiting and service. He does not go around his wounds. He goes through them. Every awakening, every battle, every great feast, where he has to speak about Russ and feel the pain of that absence in front of hundreds of warriors who are watching his every word for truth. He goes through it. He has been going through it for longer than most civilizations have existed. That is what makes him, in my view, the single most compelling character in the Space Wolves' entire legendary history. Not the combat record, which is extraordinary. Not the age, which is unprecedented. Yet the fact that underneath all of it is a person who has been trying to be enough for 10,000 years, for a Primarch who left without saying why. He still doesn't know if he is, but he keeps being it anyway. Thank you so much for watching. If this kind of deep lore dive is what you're here for, please consider subscribing to Finn the Emperor. We do this all the time, and there is an enormous amount of ground still to cover in this universe. Drop a like if Bjorn's story moved something in you, and leave a comment telling me which other ancient warrior or legendary figure you would like to hear about next. There are so many stories waiting in the darkness of the 41st millennium, and I cannot wait to tell them with you. Until next time, watch the skies, keep your oaths, and remember, somewhere beneath Asahim, the oldest warrior in the Imperium is dreaming and waiting for a king who promised to come back, for Russ, for Fenris.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.